Today I want to illustrate what happens when the church colludes with political powers, and I use the wisdom of post-colonial theologians from Africa, Asia, and South America to point out the changes we need to make as we wrestle with our colonial past. To do this, I'll be looking specifically at the residential school system in Canada. And full disclosure, what I'm presenting today is one part of a paper that I wrote for a course on queer post-colonial liberation theologies in December 2019. And to warn you, this will include discussion on childhood abuse. An anonymous survivor of Kamloops Indian Residential School said to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, quote, "The residential school took my culture, language, and my freedom. I know my language and culture, and I am still scared to use it to this day. It hurts deep inside." End quote. The history and impact of the residential school system in Canada is perhaps one of the clearest examples of church complicity with dominant societal powers. By the 1880s, the Canadian government implemented a program of boarding schools that explicitly intended to alienate Aboriginal children from their parents and to destroy the very foundations of Aboriginal culture. Far from educating their students, many of these schools were poorly built and funded, relying on child labor to offset costs, and becoming widely regarded as having been little better than vectors of disease and pedophilia. While most schools had closed by the 1980s, the last one only ceased operations in 1996. In their final report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, established in 2008, named Canada's treatment of Indigenous people as an act of physical, biological, and cultural genocide. The Government of Canada subtracted the operation of these schools to the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Presbyterian, and United Church of Canada denominations, who equally viewed this as an opportunity for evangelism. Writes Elizabeth Furness, "For their part, the missionaries took advantage of the apparatus of the state to advance their own form of religious colonization. They acquired a literally captive audience to educate and convert to their particular faith without competition from other religious denominations." The Church's goal was not just to win converts, but to supplant Indigenous identity with European culture. As the TRC puts it, quote, "Missionaries viewed Aboriginal culture as a barrier to both spiritual salvation and the ongoing existence of Aboriginal people. They were determined to replace traditional economic pursuits with European-style peasant agriculture, and they believed that cultural transformation required the imposition of societal control and separation from both traditional communities and European settlements." End quote. Here we see a deep collusion between church and colonialism, between faith and political powers, to the point where European culture and Christianity become synonymous. Of the many cruelties committed by the residential schools, the one that illustrates best the church's complicity is the banning of Indigenous languages. The early missionaries to Canada's First Nations and Inuit peoples demonstrated a great interest in learning the local languages. Learning Indigenous languages was an essential first step in evangelism and was a point of pride for missionaries. Canada's oldest hymn, the Huron Carol, was written in the Wendat, the Huron language, by Jesuit Jean Bébeuf in 1642. Jesuit missionaries on Manitoulin Island in Ontario taught and preached in the local language and participated in the development of an Ojibwe dictionary. However, as David F. Shaman documents in his study of the Jesuit residential schools at Spanish Ontario, there was an increasing pressure from the government to restrict the use of non-English languages. While it was the policy of the Catholic Church to present the gospel in native languages, the Jesuit schools gradually acquiesced to the government's demands. By the 1930s, boys at this Spanish school in Ontario were forbidden to speak their native language. This created a problem for the Jesuits in that children, when they returned home, could no longer pray with their families or speak the responses in Mass. One school official lamented, yet defended this reality to another priest, writing, "I do believe, Father, that we could again resurrect the old custom of Ojibwe prayers, and that would be to the glory of God for a certain number, but my argument is that it would never meet with the approval of the powers that be." Across Canada, church-run schools showed little resistance to the government's intention to destroy Indigenous language, with some schools adopting an even more aggressive stance. Residential school survivor William Herney shared with the TRC that he would have his mouth violently washed with soap by a clergy person whenever he was caught speaking Mi'kmaq. The eradication of a language has nothing to do with the gospel of Christ. No theology or spiritual practice of Christianity has ever required new converts to abandon their mother tongues. Even in the residential schools, while children were forced to speak English, staff continued to speak with each other in French and other European languages. Language was never the issue. Indigeneity was. The fact that churches engaged in this behavior demonstrates a capitulating of faith, or a willful selling of it, to the demands of colonialism and political power. When the issue of residential schools started to become more widely known to the Canadian public by the late 1980s, the passage of time enabled the churches to better see the grave mistake they had made. "We confused Western ways with the gospel of Christ," said the Right Reverend Robert Smith, moderator of the United Church. "We imposed our civilization as a condition for accepting the gospel." Speaking at Lac St. Anne, Father Doug Crosby, president of the Oblate Conference of Canada, said, "We apologize for the part we played in the cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and religious imperialism that was part of the mentality with which the peoples of Europe first met the Aboriginal peoples, and which consistency has lurked behind the way native peoples of Canada have been treated by civil governments and by the churches." In acknowledging its complicity with colonialism, the Presbyterian Church in Canada also adopted its confession in 1994. These apologies and confessions were meaningful first steps towards reconciliation, but they are also a significant recognition of a time in history when the Church was swept along by colonial powers. The full scope of residential schools and its ramification on Indigenous peoples and the churches is only starting to be recognized. With the final report of the TRC released in 2015, theological reflection on these events, especially by First Nation, Métis, and Inuit theologians, is in its infancy. The problem of colonialism, however, is not new. There is much that Canadian theologians can learn from the cultural analysis of post-colonial theologians in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The theology that emerges from the church post-residential schools must reconsider and revise its position on salvation and redemption, the nature of authority, and how truth itself is discerned. Such a change will not be easy. We have inherited a theology that was shaped by political forces, stressing sacrifice, pain, and individual virtues. Redemption and salvation came through the personal cost of suffering and carrying one's cross. That is why in residential schools, the suffering of children was deemed a necessary step towards saving their souls. Recounting the playroom in Kamsack, Saskatchewan, Fred Brass describes how Indigenous people were depicted. He said, "There was a picture of stairs, and at the bottom of those stairs was Indian people, and there was a fire. And above the stairs there was Jesus and the angels, and that's what we were told. If we didn't change our ways, that's how we were going to end up. That's a picture that will always stay in my mind." It was the threat of hell that underpinned a lot of the corporal punishment and abuse. Teachers and principals felt justified for threatening violence if it saved a child from participating in Indigenous rituals which they feared were evil and could lead to eternal damnation. To be saved, indigenous children would be expected to leave their ethnic heritage, language, and rituals behind. It wasn't enough to become Christian, they had to also become white. In light of this, there is an obligation for post-colonial Canadian theologies to challenge the concepts of salvation and redemption, and even the belief in a literal heaven or hell. For survivors of residential schools, as it is for post-colonial theologians, doctrines are not to be trusted based on the self-reputed authority of the church alone. When it comes to Scripture, for example, interpretations cannot be accepted with blind obedience the way that they were in the past. What is needed instead in reading the Bible is meaning-making, not meaning-receiving. Discerning what the Bible says becomes a communal process of discovery and meaning-making, open to the potential of new understandings and new voices added to the discussion. For the church today, it means seeking the voice of divine truth within indigenous spiritualities and other non-Western theologies. For an indigenous context, an emphasis on justice, inclusion, and relationality is also essential. Religious truth is not found in creeds or articles of faith, but in the way that those creedal statements affect our relationship to others. They become true when they bring about love and justice. This itself acts as a safeguard for justice. If it is believed that religious truth is held in the hands of experts, well, that enables abusers, like the priest who had assaulted Larry Roger Listener, who had said to him, "God's going to punish you if you say anything." An openness to inquiry, however, disperses authority and power. In post-colonial theology, no one person can claim to be an expert in God. Rather, it is when the community shares collective wisdom that divine truth is revealed. As post-colonial theologies disperse authority, they also blur the rigid boundaries that are often imposed by religion. One tool of colonial oppression was to divide communities against each other, and to keep tribes and family members at odds. Colonialization, writes Kenneth Hamilton, depends on false binary oppositions, using those binaries to compartmentalize one agenda against another, one race against another. In contrast, the process of decolonization must be fluid and unifying, taking in the wholeness of life. Division within families and communities was precisely the goal of residential schools. But healing is not as simple as bandaging two severed sides together. What is needed is a destabilization of all binaries. Where residential schools separated boys from girls, teachers from students, indigenous from settlers, saved from unsaved, a post-colonial approach would seat all parties in a circle to hear and learn from each other equally. This blurring of binaries even extends to that of oppressor and oppressed, acknowledging the intersectional complexity of oppression. The brush of colonialism paints everyone it touches with guilt. No one is perfect, and no one completely evil. Post-colonial theologians remind the church that the people must be entrusted themselves with the work of theological reflection and cultural critique. Only they can fully appreciate the subtleties and complexities of their cultures, and only they can determine for themselves the nature of divine truth. This respect for cultural context in the work of local theologians is critical when addressing the history of Canadian residential schools. There are multiple layers to colonialism, culture, and faith. With the loss of language, many Indigenous people struggle to identify with their own First Nation, Métis, and Inuit cultures. The process of reclaiming their ethnic heritage as a point of pride is only just beginning. What we see from post-colonial theologians in other parts of the world is that the work of discerning the truths of faith in the midst of this cultural struggle will take time. It is vital, however, to allow the time needed to make space to sit in circle with one another and to welcome the destabilizing of our own doctrinal certainties. The Church has never been an entity wholly separate from culture. Our theology and core beliefs have long been corrupted by the powers of capitalism and patriarchy. By looking at the example of residential schools in Canada, we can see the harm caused whenever the Church blurs faith with political power. When cultural blinders keep us from seeing the divine in our neighbor, the Church not only inflicts pain, but can severely damage the witness of Christ's gospel. By using the tools of post-colonial theologians, we can better analyze our own cultural contexts, making space for other voices to critique our theology. This self-awareness and sensitivity will be indispensable as the Church engages in the work of healing and reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors.